The road into Uluṟu-Kata National Park is sealed the entire way. It ends in a car park with painted lines, a signboard, and a paved path running toward a rock that stands 348 meters above a flat plain. At the Valley of the Winds trailhead, 25 kilometers west, there are no toilets, a drinking tap, and an emergency radio, and that is the whole of it. There is no shade on the rock's flanks. There is no shade for most of the 9.4 kilometers around its base. That is the first detail worth holding, because everything else in this place is designed to suggest otherwise. At 3 p.m. in January, the mean relative humidity here is 18%, which means sweat leaves the skin before a person feels it leave. A walking track closes at 11 a.m. on the strength of a forecast made the night before, on a morning that still feels pleasant. And in July 2018, a helicopter lifted a dying man off this rock and flew him to a clinic. Not a hospital, a clinic. This channel documents the physical reality of places that kill quietly. Subscribe if that is the ground you want to stand on. Begin at the trailhead. At 7 a.m. in January, the Basewalk is agreeable. The path is level and well maintained, passing mulga woodland, waterholes, and cave art, with parts running through sacred sites where signage marks clearly that photography is prohibited. The full loop is 10.6 kilometers and takes 3 to 4 hours. There is almost no elevation change across the entire circuit. By 11 a.m., the mean maximum temperature for the month is closing on 38.6 degrees Celsius. The surface is throwing that heat back upward, and a person who started at 7 is now on the far side of a rock 3.6 kilometers long, with the car park behind a wall of stone. That is the ground. It never rises. It only lasts. Central Australian air is dry, and dry heat suppresses the sensation of sweating. The sweat evaporates before the skin registers it. Fluid loss becomes invisible and continuous. Parks Australia names 3 specific hazards on its own safety page: heat stress, heat stroke, and hyponatraemia, which is low blood sodium, leading to an inability to regulate water. That last one is the trap inside the trap. A walker drinking heavily, but replacing no salt, develops confusion and nausea that read exactly like dehydration. And the intuitive response, drink more, makes it worse. The park's stated requirement is at least 1 liter of water per hour. In 2010, a 54-year-old man from Victoria collapsed on the climb route, 160 meters from the base. He died. He had covered a fraction of the ascent. Of the deaths recorded on this rock, the majority were people who fell or succumbed to heat stress and dehydration, and the pattern does not favor the fit or the young. The rock's scale is part of the mechanism. It is 348 meters high and stands alone on an open plain, which strips away every reference point the eye normally uses to judge distance. What appears to be just to that corner is a kilometer. There is no marker between where you are and where you think you are. A person who feels entirely well at the Mala car park at 7 in the morning can be 4 kilometers into a shadeless loop by mid-morning, on a track with no shortcut back, carrying a fluid deficit they have not felt and cannot see. The climb route ran up the steep western face. A chain was built into the steeper parts of the path in 1964, following deaths on the rock, some 300 meters of it, attached to a 138 steel posts. It was a guide, not a safety system. The face is steep, the surface is smooth sandstone, and there was no shade on it at any hour. That is the physical fact. The route required no real climbing. It was a hike up a very steep hill with a handrail. Which is exactly why it killed. A route with no technical barrier selects for people who prepare for nothing: the unconditioned, the elderly, the visitor with a queue at their back and a flight out the next morning. The demand it placed on them was sudden and near maximal. The dominant cause of death here was never the fall. It was the heart. The National Museum of Australia records 37 lives lost during the climb, with many more evacuated from its slopes. Other accounts give 35, or 36, or 38, and the starting date of the record floats between the 1940s and the 1950s. At least 35, and by most counts 37. On 3 July 2018, a 76-year-old Japanese man collapsed and lost consciousness on the steepest section of the route at about 4 in the afternoon. Rangers reached him first and performed CPR until SES crews arrived. He was flown to the clinic at Yulara and could not be revived. The chain was dismantled after the closure. The memorial plaques to the climbers who died were left in place, out of respect for their families. They remain on a rock that no one may now climb. There is no campground at the base of Uluru. The one that was here closed in 1983, the motels closed in late 1984 when Yulara opened outside the park boundary. Pre-dawn on that ground now, there is silence. Then flies. Nothing is watching from the scrub because the animals that were once fed here are gone with the food. That is what the ground is now. It was not always. Before August 1980, dingoes frequented the camping area. Some 18 to 25 of them were known to visit it. A number of attacks on children occurred in the preceding months, none causing serious injury. Chief Ranger Derek Roth had written to authorities requesting ammunition for a cull, warning that drought had left the animals starving and dangerous. On the night of 17 August 1980, at around 8 p.m., 9-week-old Azaria Chamberlain was taken by a dingo from her family's tent at that campground. Her body was never found. Blood-stained clothing was located 7 days later on boulders near the rock's base. At the fourth inquest, on 12 June 2012, Coroner Elizabeth Morris found the cause of death was being attacked and taken by a dingo, and stated that dingoes can and do cause harm to humans. The escalation was documented for months before it became fatal, and every incident in that sequence was read, at the time, as harmless. If you have been to Uluru, tell us in the comments what the physical experience was actually like. Not the view, the reality of moving through it in the hours either side of the heat. What follows is what happens when these dangers stop occurring separately and start occurring in the same body, at the same moment. Rain here averages 266.7 millimeters a year across 28.9 days. When it falls on Uluru, it does not soak in. The rock sheets it, rain produces waterfalls down the flanks, and anything sitting on top runs into the water holes below within minutes. That is what the water does. What it leaves behind is the problem. The surface up close is flaky red with gray patches. The flakes are the residue of mineral decay. Where water and oxygen have broken down minerals in the Arcos, the red is iron rusting. The original gray shows inside the caves. This is not grippy bedrock. It is a decaying skin over smooth sandstone that is steep and uneven, and wet conditions make it dangerously slippery. Wind is the second half. Mean 9 a.m. Wind speed at Yulara Airport is 21 kilometers per hour in January 17 across the year, and an isolated 348-meter obstacle on an open plain accelerates that flow over its summit. It is exceptionally windy up there. On 25 October 2019, the final legal day of climbing, rangers warned hundreds of tourists waiting at the base before dawn that high winds might close the route before it opened. The ascent began 3 hours behind schedule. The wind decided the schedule on the most anticipated single day in the climb's history, under a clear sky. August, the driest month, averages 4.7 millimeters of rain. It falls inside the busiest season. The overwhelming majority of people who come here will never see this surface wet, and will therefore leave believing they have seen what it is. Alice Springs is some 470 kilometers away. That is the nearest city. Between it and this rock is desert. Yulara sits 15 kilometers outside the park's northern boundary, with about 1,000 residents and a tourist population that can temporarily add 2,000 to 4,000. There is an airport 20 kilometers from the rock. There is a medical center. That is the geometry. Now the distinction that matters. The Ayers Rock Medical Center is a clinic. It has consultation rooms, emergency facilities, and a paramedic service, and it is the only Royal Flying Doctor Service site in the country that operates road ambulances. Aircraft from the RFD's base at Alice Springs handle emergencies and patient transfer. The RFD's describes its own core work in Outback terms: a child with a snake bite, a crash on a remote dirt road, sudden severe illness across a service area of roughly 1.25 million square kilometers. It is a serious operation. It is not a hospital sitting at the base of the rock. On 3 July 2018, a helicopter had to be used to retrieve the 76-year-old man from the climb route and take him back to the Yulara clinic. Duty Superintendent Sean Gill confirmed he passed away there. Recovery has its own arithmetic. When British tourist David Brett, 31, fell during an evening climb on 26 January 1986, it took 8 days to find him. His body was located on 2nd February below the bluff where he lost his footing because of the sheer size of the rock and the scrub around its base. 8 days, at a landmark photographed by hundreds of thousands of people a year. Karu Lookout is the first lookout on the Valley of the Wind circuit, about half an hour in from the car park. At 11 a.m., on any day the forecast reaches 36 degrees or above, a ranger stands at that gate and turns walkers back. The remaining 6 kilometers of the loop simply cease to exist. In November through March, this triggers on most days. That is the gate. Here is what it exists to prevent. The dangers here do not sit side by side. They stack. In one sequence, in one body. Heat produces the physiological load. Exertion converts that load into cardiac demand. The dry air conceals the fluid deficit until judgment is already degraded, and degraded judgment is what puts a walker off the marked track onto flaking Arcos, or onto the northeast section of the Basewalk that the park closes above 40 degrees. Each individual step is survivable. The chain is what kills. Remoteness then multiplies whatever the chain produces. A cardiac arrest in a suburb of Sydney and a cardiac arrest at Karu Lookout are the identical physiological event with entirely different survival curves. This is precisely why the death record here is dominated by hearts and heat rather than by falls. The rock never needed to drop anyone. It only needed to hold them 2 hours from a defibrillator. Then, the ban restructured the whole thing. The climb closed on 26 October 2019. The population that used to die on it did not stop arriving. Around 60% of visitors still walk to Mutitjulu Waterhole. Around 40% still hike the Valley of the Winds, graded 4, steep and rocky in places, 3 to 4 hours for the full 7.4 kilometers. The mechanism did not close in 2019. It moved from the vertical to the horizontal. Yulara was built deliberately in the 1970s, 15 kilometers beyond the park's northern boundary, so that accommodation could be removed from the base of the rock. It has pools, it has shuttles, it has hotels, and a medical center, and an airport. Every environmental signal a person receives on arrival says managed destination. That is the infrastructure. None of it changes the surface beyond the car park, and none of it moves the nearest hospital any closer. The gap begins there and widens. Uluru is famous as an image. The silhouette, the color change, and an image has no scale, no temperature, and no duration. The activity the photograph implies is standing still and looking. The activity actually undertaken is a 10.6 kilometer walk lasting 3 to 4 hours. The park's own advice quantifies the gap in a single number. 1 liter of water per hour. Very few people photographing a sunset believe they are about to undertake a 4-liter walk. Then there is the handrail effect, which outlived the handrail. A chain converted a lethal slope into a queue, and a queue into a bucket list item. The same cognitive move now runs on the Basewalk. It is flat, signposted, and wheelchair accessible in parts, so it is filed as safe. Flat has never been the variable. Exposure is. The Mala Walk is free, shaded and wheelchair accessible, and it sits 100 meters from terrain the park shuts for heat stroke risk. The last cause is the ban itself, read as a fix it was never designed to be. The closure was decided unanimously by the 12 members of the park's Board of Management, and senior traditional owner Sammy Wilson framed it through Chukurpa, cultural inheritance, law and stories, describing Uluru as an extremely important place rather than a playground. Under Chukurpa, Anangu carry responsibility for the well-being of visitors on their country, which made every death a burden they held. The public banked it as a safety measure. The killing mechanism was never closed. It was only made harder to see. Stripped of its reputation, its airport, and its paved paths, Uluru is this, a shadeless block of decaying sandstone, 348 meters high and 9.4 kilometers around. Standing on an open plain where the air holds 18% humidity at 3 in the afternoon and the nearest hospital is 470 kilometers away. It does not push people off. It removes water from them without their knowledge, asks their heart for more than it has, and then keeps them where help arrives by aircraft. The moment it showed itself plainly was 3 July 2018. A 76-year-old man collapsed at 4 in the afternoon on the steepest section. Rangers performed CPR on bare rock. A helicopter carried him to a clinic. Everything worked exactly as designed. And it was not enough because the geometry was fixed before he ever left the car park. The record cannot answer the open question. When a place has been made comfortable enough that its danger is invisible, what does a person standing on it owe to the reality of where they actually are? Subscribe for more places examined by their physical record rather than their reputation.